Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was on a morning of stifling stillness that I, Dr. John Watson, was summoned once again into the atmosphere of mystery and deduction that seemed forever to drift about 221B Baker Street. A faint fog curled about the rooftops of London, clinging to chimney bricks and gas lamps like the last breath of some dying ghost. I had scarcely removed my gloves when Mrs. Hudson handed me a note, the corners still damp from dew and the ink smudged, as if the message had been composed in a trembling hand. Holmes read it only once, and the usual gleam in his eye took on a new unfamiliar shade, one that was colder, more clinical, and tinged perhaps with something near apprehension. "It would seem," he murmured, "that the dead may yet smile at us." I frowned. "What on earth does that mean, Holmes?" He handed me the note. "Mr. Holmes, you do not know me, but I have watched your cases in the Times with great interest. I write you now not as a client, but as a witness to something unnatural. This morning at precisely 9:03, the condemned Mrs. Celia Willoughby was hanged at Newgate Prison for the murder of her husband. And yet, as the trapdoor gave way and her body fell, she smiled. Not the twitch of a dying nerve, but a full, knowing, eerie smile. There is something dreadfully wrong. Please, see for yourself before the body is buried. J.E. Collingwood, Prison Chaplain." Holmes rose without a word, swept his coat over his shoulders, and nodded toward the door. "Come, Watson. When a woman smiles at the gallows, it is not death she greets, but a secret we have yet to uncover." The coach jostled through Fleet Street, and Holmes remained silent as we passed St. Paul's and rattled toward the grim brick walls of Newgate. Fog pooled in the gutters like spilled secrets, and crows circled above the rooftops thick as whispers. When we arrived, the warden greeted us stiffly, unsure whether to laugh at the notion or take it seriously. Chaplain Collingwood, however, met us with grave eyes. "I've seen many go to their deaths, Mr. Holmes," the chaplain said as he led us down the corridor. "I've seen tears, rage, prayers, curses, but never that. Never peace, never amusement." We entered the cold holding room where the body lay. Mrs. Celia Willoughby, widow now executed murderess, was draped in the standard grey sheet, her hands bound and face pale from asphyxiation. Yet there it was. Even in death, the corners of her mouth turned upward ever so slightly. A smile, faint but undeniable. Watson, though trained in the sciences of flesh and failure, felt the chill settle in his spine. Could it be rigor mortis, a final muscular contraction? Holmes bent low, examined her jawline, then traced the faint bruise of the noose. No, this is not the spasm of death. It is the residue of choice. He straightened. And if her death was chosen, I suspect her crime may not have been. We left the chamber with more questions than answers. Holmes lit a cigarette as we emerged into the narrow yard. "Tell me, Watson," he said, eyes narrowed against the mist. "If a woman condemned for murder smiles upon the moment of her hanging, what does she know that no one else does?" "That she is innocent?" I ventured. Holmes gave the ghost of a nod. "Or worse," he said, "that she is guilty of something much larger, something that did not end with her death." Holmes remained quiet during our return to Baker Street, his chin sunk into the high collar of his coat, eyes half closed behind a veil of cigarette smoke. I knew that look well. He was deep in thought, swimming through the hidden currents beneath the facts we had just witnessed. I, for my part, was still troubled by the image of that faint smile on the widow's lips, frozen in death, like a secret note passed in class. Seen, but unread. Once inside, Holmes tossed his coat aside, ignored Mrs. Hudson's inquiry about tea, and crossed immediately to the desk where our clippings from the Times were neatly stacked. He began rifling through them with uncharacteristic haste, until he found what he was looking for, a yellowed edition from 3 weeks prior. He held it up with one long finger. "Watson, refresh your memory. What do we know of Mrs. Celia Willoughby's crime?" I took the paper, scanning the column that had at the time struck me as one of the more straightforward pieces of newsprint. Prominent Kensington solicitor, found poisoned, wife arrested at scene. I read aloud, Mr. Henry Willoughby, respected solicitor of Hastings and Blythe, was found dead in his study on the evening of July 4th, having ingested a fatal dose of digitalis. His wife, Mrs. Celia Willoughby, was arrested at the residence shortly thereafter. Scotland Yard detectives discovered a vial of powdered foxglove, a teacup containing residue of the poison, and an unsigned letter in Mrs. Willoughby's own writing, addressed to her husband and threatening retribution for unnamed betrayals. The Crown Prosecution Service moved swiftly, and a jury returned a guilty verdict after just 4 hours of deliberation. Mrs. Willoughby refused to appeal the sentence and offered no defense during the trial beyond a simple statement. "I have said what I came to say." I paused, folding the paper with deliberate care. "You recall, Holmes, I remarked at the time how quickly it all moved, almost indecently so." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and with a trial so neatly wrapped one must ask, who tied the bow?" He crossed to the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. The coals glowed faintly as he stared into them, as if reading truths from the embers. "There is something uncomfortably theatrical about it all," he continued. "The poison, the handwritten threat, the refusal to defend herself, the smile at death. Either she was mad, or she wanted the world to believe a version of events that obscured a different, deeper truth. You believe she was protecting someone? Possibly," Holmes murmured. "Or perhaps she was warning someone." He turned to me abruptly. "Fetch your notes, Watson. We shall examine the known facts again, not through the lens of a jury, but through the eyes of those who see the invisible." I opened my journal and began listing what we had. Victim: Henry Willoughby, 52, solicitor. No criminal record, but rumors of financial strain. Cause of death: digitalis poisoning. Deliberate, not accidental. Scene: study locked from inside. Mrs. Willoughby had a key. Poison found in teacup on desk, evidence. Vial of powdered foxglove found in the housekeeper's closet. Handwritten note in Celia's handwriting. Trial: no defense. Mrs. Willoughby offered no testimony beyond a cryptic final remark. Holmes pointed at the 4th line. "There, that is our first fissure. The vial?" "Precisely. Found in the housekeeper's closet, not in Celia's possession. If she wished to poison him in a premeditated act, would she not have hidden the substance more cleverly, or disposed of it altogether?" "It could have been placed there by accident, or on purpose," Holmes said darkly. He resumed pacing. "And the letter, an unsigned threat in her own handwriting, conveniently left in the room? No forger worth his salt would have left a signature. But a guilty party might ensure the victim's wife appeared appropriately menacing, especially if she refused to cooperate. You suspect the note was planted?" "I suspect," Holmes said, "that we are meant to suspect her." A soft knock at the door interrupted our deliberations. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a calling card on a tray. "Another visitor, Mr. Holmes, a Mr. Julian Hargrave." Holmes took the card, turned it once, and gave a low whistle. Curious timing. Hargrave is a junior partner at Hastings and Blythe, the very firm where Henry Willoughby worked. We invited the man in. He was well dressed, almost overly so, with a rose-colored cravat and a face like wax polished too many times. His nervousness was poorly concealed, though he tried for a cordial air. "I'm terribly sorry to arrive unannounced, Mr. Holmes, but I heard you were looking into the Willoughby case." "We are revisiting it, yes," Holmes said, smoothly. "Please have a seat. What brings you here, Mr. Hargrave?" Hargrave glanced between us, then leaned forward. "It's about the trial. About Celia, I should have said something sooner. Then now is as good a time as any." Hargrave swallowed hard. "Henry, Mr. Willoughby, he was not a well-liked man. I don't say that lightly. He was manipulative, especially with the women in the office. Celia tolerated much, but she began withdrawing after she discovered certain letters between Henry and one of our junior clerks." Holmes' fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Which clerk?" Hargrave looked ashamed. "My fiancée, Miss Abigail Lenner. Was this ever brought to the attention of the court?" Hargrave shook his head. No. Abigail refused to speak of it. She said if the truth came out, her reputation would be destroyed. She begged me to let it go, but I think Celia knew. And I think she might have written that letter in anger, not as a threat, but as heartbreak. Where is Miss Lena now? Holmes asked. Hargrave hesitated. She left the firm 2 days before the trial, vanished. I haven't seen her since. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Did she leave a forwarding address? No. Holmes rose, suddenly brisk. Watson? Coat? Mr. Hargrave, I thank you for your honesty. If Miss Lena disappeared so conveniently before a trial that could have exposed her liaison with the victim, then I fear we are no longer looking at a simple crime of passion. We are looking at a performance, one staged with remarkable precision. Hargrave stood. Do you think, Abigail? I think, Holmes said, reaching for his hat, that a woman who vanishes before a trial and a widow who smiles at her own execution are two halves of the same riddle. And riddles, he added, are things I do not abide unsolved. We stepped out once more into the London dusk, the gaslights flickering to life above the fog-choked streets. Somewhere out there, a vanished clerk carried secrets. Somewhere in the cold silence of a grave, a woman had smiled to protect or provoke. Holmes's voice was low as we turned onto the cobbled walk. She smiled, Watson, because she knew someone was still watching. And now, so are we. The fog had thickened by the time we emerged once more onto Baker Street. It crawled along the cobbles like something alive, dulling the clang of distant hoofbeats and swallowing the glow of carriage lamps into a grey void. Holmes walked swiftly, hat pulled low and gaze narrowed, but not in idle thought. He had the bearing of a hound that had caught scent, alert, deliberate, driven by something just beyond articulation. We returned only briefly to 221B to retrieve a small notebook from Holmes's desk, one he kept for tracking names and addresses, not listed in any official register, and within minutes we were back outside, stepping into a cab and directing it to Clapham. Holmes explained as we rode. Abigail Lena's last known lodgings, he said, tapping the notebook with his forefinger. Registered under a Miss A. Lena at a small boarding house on Carradine Street. She rented a room for 4 months, paid in cash, no references. Is that unusual? For a clerk at a respectable firm, yes. For someone with something to hide, no. We arrived just as a light drizzle began to descend from the clouds, casting the street in a sheen that caught the reflections of passing hansoms. The boarding house stood quietly in the row, modest, well-kept, with a blue door whose paint had faded from exposure. A thin woman with a knitting needle tucked behind her ear answered after Holmes's second knock. She eyed us with cautious suspicion until Holmes presented his card and softened his voice. We're making inquiries regarding a former lodger, Miss Abigail Lena. You may recall her? The woman hesitated. Small thing, dark hair, nervous eyes, kept to herself, left, 6 weeks back. Holmes tilted his head. No word since? None. Packed up one morning and vanished. Left behind a hat box she never came for. May we see it? She hesitated once more, but finally nodded and led us to a narrow storeroom tucked behind the staircase. From among a stack of forgotten trunks and boxes, she retrieved the object in question, a cream-colored hatbox with a cracked leather handle. Holmes took it carefully, lifting the lid with a slowness that seemed almost reverent. Inside were a few mundane items, a torn glove, a pressed flower between pages of a hymn book, and at the bottom, a folded sheet of notepaper with one corner. Torn away. Holmes read silently, then passed it to me. He says I mean nothing, but I know too much now. If Celia truly intends to confront him, I cannot let her do it alone. Perhaps she is stronger than I thought. If I vanish, if something happens, do not believe the story they will print. The handwriting was rushed and uneven, dated 2 days before Henry Willoughby's death. Holmes gently closed the box, his expression unreadable. It would seem Miss Lena did not vanish voluntarily, and that she knew what was coming. But how could she not have come forward during the trial? I asked. Her testimony could have saved Celia. Holmes shook his head. Unless she was never given the chance. We returned to the cab in silence, and Holmes directed us next to Scotland Yard. You intend to speak with Lestrade? I asked. I intend to speak with the arresting officer, Holmes corrected, and see what was omitted from the record. It was Inspector Colin Braga who received us in the stone halls of the yard, a stocky man with a crumpled moustache and the weariness of someone used to being one step behind Holmes. He greeted us with cautious civility and summoned the case file from his cabinet without argument. Holmes turned the pages quickly, but with precision, reading silently before speaking. There's no mention of any correspondence between Henry Willoughby and anyone but his wife. Braga shrugged, because there wasn't. The only letter we found was the one she wrote. You searched the house thoroughly. Of course. Desk, drawers, waste bin, standard procedure. Holmes flipped back a page. You interviewed Abigail Lenner. Braga hesitated. Briefly. She was at the firm when we questioned the staff. Nervous thing. Said she knew nothing. Denied any impropriety. And you were satisfied with that? She vanished before the trial, didn't she? We tried to locate her but got nowhere. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he looked up, his voice low and calm. Inspector, I believe Miss Lenner's disappearance was no accident. I believe her testimony would have unraveled your case against Celia Willoughby. Braga bristled. The evidence was clear. The tea was poisoned. The note was hers. The motive was established. Then how do you explain this, sir? Holmes retrieved the letter from the hat box and laid it on the inspector's desk. Dated 2 days before the murder. Written in the same hand as the threat you found in the study. But the tone is entirely different. She wasn't confessing, she was warning someone. Braga read the note, his frown deepening with each word. Holmes continued. And tell me, why was the teacup with the residue not sent for independent chemical analysis? I find no mention of it in the forensic ledger. Braga shifted uncomfortably. There were delays. The lab was... You never tested it, Holmes said coldly, because the letter told you what you wished to hear, and Celia's silence allowed you to seal your case without challenge. There was no answer to that. Braga merely stared at the paper in silence. Outside once more, Holmes's mood had shifted. He walked quickly, almost restlessly, as though the fog itself irritated him. Watson, he said as we reached the corner, we are running out of time. Someone took great pains to ensure that Celia Willoughby's trial went unquestioned. Someone who stood to gain by Henry Willoughby's death and by silencing the only 2 women who could speak otherwise. I matched his stride. You think Abigail was killed? I think, Holmes said grimly, that she is either dead or imprisoned somewhere, and that her continued silence is costing us the truth. A sudden gust of wind tore at the fog, revealing the pale crescent of the moon above us. Holmes stopped and looked skyward, then lowered his gaze. Return to Baker Street, Watson. I must make a call. To whom? A man who owes me a favor from the opium dens of Limehouse. If Abigail is still alive, there is one place she may have been taken, a house whose doors do not open to those who knock, but to those who whisper. I stared at him, startled. You're going alone. For now, he said quietly. But if I am not back by dawn, bring your revolver. And with that, he vanished into the fog. The silence in 221B Baker Street felt unnatural without Holmes's presence. I sat by the hearth long after midnight, eyes flicking between the fire's low glow and the street beyond the window, hoping for the sound of his footfall or the silhouette of his coat emerging from the fog. The hours dragged. I had seen Holmes disappear into London's underworld before, but rarely with this weight in his tone, this sense of a countdown ticking just beyond his words. At last, a little before 5, the door opened. Holmes entered, swiftly, soaked to the elbows, his coat reeking of soot and damp tobacco. He said nothing as he moved past me, but his eyes were alive, glinting with a sharpness I had not seen since the Adler affair. He peeled off his gloves and tossed them aside before sitting down and locking his fingers beneath his chin. She's alive. I stood at once. Abigail? He nodded. Barely. I found her in a private lodging above an illegal apothecary on Covey Street. The establishment functions as a front, a place where inconvenient people disappear under the pretense of treatment for nervous disorders. She was not a patient. She was a prisoner. My breath caught. Is she safe now? I arranged. for her to be moved to a discreet address in Paddington under the care of Mrs. Estelle Blackmere, a midwife I trust implicitly. No official inquiries will reach her until we are ready. I sat, tension slackening from my shoulders. Did she speak? Holmes poured himself a brandy before answering. She spoke little. She is shaken, but not broken. More importantly, she has confirmed what we long suspected. He turned toward me, eyes fixed on mine. She did not simply have an affair with Henry Willoughby. She discovered that he had defrauded multiple clients at his firm, siphoning off inheritance funds, meant for the widows of former clients. One of the victims was a cousin of Celia's, a woman who died destitute while Henry drank champagne with her money. I stared. And Abigail confronted him? She confronted him, and he threatened her, not with exposure but with ruin. He told her no one would believe her, that if she opened her mouth he'd make her look like a scorned woman seeking revenge. She fled, but not before telling Celia. My heart tightened, and Celia took it upon herself to act. Or to confront, Holmes said, voice quieter. Abigail insists that Celia never spoke of killing him. She was angry, yes, but she intended only to confront him with the letter Abigail helped her write, the one found in the study. But Abigail never heard from her again. 2 days later, Celia was arrested. The fire cracked softly in the hearth, as if punctuating the silence between us. Then who administered the poison? I asked slowly. If not Celia? Holmes took a deep breath. That, Watson, is the final knot yet to be untangled. But I believe we now understand the motive. Celia was not the murderer. She was the scapegoat. And Abigail, she was silenced because she held the key to unraveling it all. I stood. Then we must go to Scotland Yard. Demand the case be reopened. Holmes shook his head. Not yet. We need proof, something indisputable. And I believe our next step is to speak to the last person to see Henry Willoughby alive, his firm's senior partner, Edmund Blythe. The partner? Indeed, Holmes said. He has remained curiously silent throughout this affair. He gave only a brief statement during the trial, confirming Henry's professional record, and offered no comment on the charges against Celia. Too tidy. Too quiet. We left as the grey dawn broke across Baker Street. By the time we arrived at the offices of Hastings and Blythe in Kensington, the clerks had only just begun their morning routines. Mr. Blythe's secretary, a thin, bird-like woman, who appeared both overworked and fiercely protective, attempted to turn us away until Holmes produced a letter of introduction from Lord Treadway, one of Blythe's oldest clients. Tell him, Holmes said evenly, that this concerns the reputation of his entire firm. Moments later we were ushered into a room of heavy leather and darker wood, where Edmund Blythe waited behind a desk, too ornate for modesty. He rose, slow and composed, a man who measured every word before uttering it. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am uncertain what your purpose is here, as the case in question has long since reached its legal conclusion. Holmes offered a tight smile. Some cases conclude on paper, Mr. Blythe. Others linger in the shadows of fact, waiting for sunlight. Blythe's face did not change. Say your piece. Very well, Holmes said. We believe Henry Willoughby was murdered, but not by his wife, and not with her knowledge. We also believe your firm's accounts will show irregularities, specifically a sequence of missing inheritances linked to cases Henry oversaw. Blythe's fingers tightened slightly over the edge of his desk. I have no idea what you're suggesting. You will, Holmes said. We are already tracking the beneficiaries of those estates. And more to the point, we are in possession of testimony from someone who knew the truth, Abigail Lenner. She's alive, Mr. Blythe, and she remembers everything. There was a pause. Long, brittle. Blythe sat back in his chair. And what do you hope to accomplish by dragging up these ghosts? Holmes's smile was thin. Justice, or failing that, clarity. Blythe exhaled through his nose, a trace of a sneer flickering behind his composed mask. You're a clever man, Holmes, but cleverness and influence are rarely allies. I suggest you consider the damage such accusations might do to innocent employees and clients before you rush into war with a respected firm. Holmes rose. The truth is rarely polite, Mr. Blythe. It doesn't care for reputations. As we left the building, I turned to Holmes. He knows something. Oh yes, Holmes said, eyes narrowed. He knows everything. The question is whether he played architect or merely host. We returned to Baker Street, where a telegram was waiting on the mantel. Holmes read it quickly, and a flash of something, satisfaction or concern, crossed his face. It's from Mrs. Blackmere. Abigail is awake and she's remembered something else. He turned to me. A third letter. One she was forced to burn. What did it say? Holmes turned, the paper over in his hands. It was from Celia, a letter of warning to a friend. Someone else she believed was in danger from Henry Willoughby. The letter mentioned a name. He looked at me then, sharp and cold. Edmund Blythe. I felt the blood chill in my hands. Then he was involved. Or perhaps, Holmes murmured, he was the true target all along. Henry was the blade, Blythe the hand that guided it, and Celia. Perhaps she was not confronting her husband in anger, but in desperation. Outside, the fog had not lifted, and neither, I feared, had the full truth. Holmes turned from the window. Tomorrow, Watson, we pay another visit to the coroner's office. I want to see Henry Willoughby's death certificate, and I want to know exactly what was found in his blood. The morning air carried a bitter chill as we arrived at the city coroner's office, tucked just off Cheapside behind a wrought-iron gate and a courtyard still slick from the previous night's drizzle. The corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and ledger ink, familiar, clinical, and strangely impersonal given the nature of their work. A clerk led us to a records room where Holmes presented his credentials, and within minutes we were seated across from a balding man in a brown waistcoat, thumbing through a file marked Willoughby, Henry. The coroner, a Mr. Elias March, looked over the top of his glasses as he laid out the original toxicology report. As you'll see, gentlemen, the cause of death was digitalis poisoning. Heart failure consistent with a high dose of foxglove alkaloids, ingested within an hour of the estimated time of death. Holmes leaned forward. Was the presence of any secondary substance noted? An agent used to mask the bitterness or delay? Onset, March blinked, a little surprised. Not in the official analysis, though. He flipped back a page, frowning slightly. There was a marginal trace, an unknown base compound with slight sedimentation. It was assumed to be residue from the tea itself. Holmes's fingers tapped the armrest lightly. Did you test for chloral hydrate? The coroner raised a brow. No, why would we? Because if it was used in tandem with the digitalis, it would have masked the taste entirely, allowing for a fatal dose to be swallowed without resistance. It's a common sedative, one rarely suspected unless the victim shows signs of drowsiness prior to death. March's frown deepened. There was no time of death observation of that nature. He was found seated at his desk, head bowed, as if resting. Precisely, Holmes murmured. What about handwriting? Was any analysis performed on the note left at the scene? That was passed to Scotland Yard, March replied, shaking his head. Out of our purview. Holmes took the file gently and scanned the report again. I saw him pause at a page containing sketched annotations of the crime scene, the position of the cup, the chair, the open letter. He tapped one line gently. Note the position of the deceased. Upright, head tilted forward, hand on the desk. No signs of struggle. Isn't that consistent with poisoning? I asked. Yes, but not with surprise. Some man swallowing a lethal dose unknowingly is likely to exhibit some signs of distress. Vomiting, convulsion, a toppled chair, anything. But this scene was clean, staged even, as though he was meant to be discovered in dignified stillness. There's an artifice to it, Watson. He closed the file slowly and rose. Thank you, Mr. March. Your cooperation has been invaluable. Outside again, Holmes walked at a measured pace, his breath rising visibly in the morning air. I followed closely. You believe the death was orchestrated not merely to kill, but to perform. He gave a small nod. To cement the narrative, a quiet study, a poisoned cup, a bitter letter of warning from a scorned wife. All neat, all damning. But Henry Willoughby's last moments tell a different story, one of resignation, not panic. You think he knew? I think he expected someone else, Holmes said, and I think he trusted them enough to drink without suspicion. That idea hung between us as we returned to Baker Street. Once inside, Holmes went immediately to his files. He extracted a stack of client records, copies of probate court rulings, financial settlements, and trust certificates, all tied in some way to the firm of Hastings and Blythe. Abigail mentioned one particular client, he said, flipping through the pages, an elderly widow by the name of Eleanor Griggs. Her husband left behind a considerable estate, entrusted to Willoughby for dispersal. He pulled out a sheet. Here, the estate was worth nearly £28,000, yet the dispersal shows only £9,000 reaching Mrs. Griggs. The remainder, redirected through 2 temporary holding accounts, and who authorized the movement? Holmes's voice was quiet. A signature appears here, Henry Willoughby's. But note, this second one beneath it. I leaned in. The second signature was shakier, less legible, but it was there. Edmund Blythe. He closed the file. This is our leverage. Before we could move to act on it, a sharp knock interrupted the room's silence. Mrs. Hudson entered, with a telegram on a silver tray, her expression pinched with worry. Holmes took it and read. His jaw tightened. It's from Estelle Blackmere. Abigail has disappeared. I stood so quickly my chair scraped the floor. What do you mean, vanished? She left the safe house in the early hours, according to Mrs. Blackmere. No note, no trace. The door wasn't forced, but her cloak is missing. She ran, or was persuaded to. The moment was taut. Holmes seized his coat again. We returned to Covey Street. Back through the city we flew, the fog thinning as the sun finally began to assert itself over London's soot-stained rooftops. At the apothecary where Abigail had been held, Holmes didn't wait for pleasantries. He pressed a coin into the palm of a sleepy-eyed boy sweeping the stoop. Did anyone come here? Last night? Anyone looking for Miss Lena? The boy, wide-eyed, nodded. A man, tall black gloves, said he was her cousin, had a carriage with no crest. Holmes exhaled sharply. Which direction? North. Toward the river. We were in the cab. Again within seconds. She's in danger, I said. You think it was Blythe? Blythe wouldn't dirty his hands directly, but he'd send someone persuasive, someone familiar to her perhaps, a former clerk, a hired solicitor, or worse, someone from the firm she trusted once. Where would they take her? Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he said, if they intend to silence her permanently, they won't risk a second public disappearance. They'll use water. The river? There are warehouses near Millbank, abandoned by trade, but still accessible by night. Discreet. Remote. The cab raced through the awakening streets, the sound of hooves slapping wet stone echoing our urgency. We turned down toward the river and approached a row of decaying warehouses, their brickwork weeping moisture, their windows like blind eyes. Holmes signaled the driver to halt and leapt down. We searched them all, he said, one by one. The first was empty, but for crates of spoiled linen. The second held only rusted chains and broken barrels. But in the third, we found it. A carriage wheel track in the dust, fresh, not yet disturbed by wind or time. Holmes drew his revolver. We advanced quietly through the interior, floorboards creaking beneath our weight. Then from behind a stack of crates a voice, a woman's, hushed and terrified. Please, I didn't tell them anything. Another voice, male, low and impatient. That won't matter now. Holmes moved like a shadow. I followed as he turned the corner, gun leveled, eyes unblinking. Step away from her. The man froze. He wore a solicitor's coat, but his expression was the feral mask of a cornered animal. He raised his hands slowly as Abigail broke away from his grip and stumbled toward us. Holmes moved forward, swift and decisive. Your name? The man hesitated. Howard Finch. Holmes nodded slowly. Clerk of Edmund Blythe's, dismissed 2 years ago after a client complaint. Now working as his, what, errand boy? The man scowled. Holmes handed him off to me. Watson, escort Mr. Finch to the nearest constable. Tell them to prepare a warrant. He turned to Abigail, who was trembling but alive. You did well, he said gently. It's over now. But I saw the look in Holmes's eyes even then. It wasn't over, not yet. Not until Blythe faced the very same gallows his schemes had once led another to. By the time I returned from delivering Howard Finch to the authorities, the sun had begun to break through the smog over the Thames, casting pale light across the skeletal silhouette of the warehouse district. Abigail sat bundled in Holmes's greatcoat, her face bloodless, eyes sunken from fatigue, but her hands, once trembling, were now still, resolute. Holmes remained beside her, crouched on the dusty floorboards like a physician at a bedside, his voice low and calm. As I approached, I heard the tail end of her statement. He told me I had to come with him, that Mr. Blythe would ensure my safety, that no harm would come so long as I cooperated. I believed him, Mr. Holmes, until I saw the rope, until I saw the sack. Her voice cracked. Holmes placed a hand gently on her sleeve. "You've done more than enough, Miss Lenner. We'll see to the rest." I crouched beside them. "We must get her somewhere safe." "She won't be safe until Blythe is in chains," Holmes replied, rising. "And for that we now possess everything we need." We left the warehouse under the eye of 2 constables, who had arrived in time to take a formal statement from Abigail and secure the scene. Holmes said little on the ride back to Baker Street, but his mind was visibly in motion. That peculiar tension, his shoulders drawn inward, fingers steepled just beneath the lip of his chin, told me he was not merely plotting an arrest. He was staging a reckoning. Once inside the sitting room, Holmes went directly to the writing desk and began composing a series of short, pointed notes. He handed them to me one by one as he finished. This to Inspector Braga, this to the solicitor general, and this, he said, sealing the third with a final flick of the wax, to the editors of the Times. Let us ensure that when the noose tightens, it does so with an audience. You're planning to expose Blythe publicly? I'm planning, Holmes said, to give him no path but confession. Before I could respond, a knock came at the door. It was the post. Among the usual circulars and advertisements, a small envelope bearing no return address, its seal pressed with the emblem of a lion and scale. Holmes opened it, scanned the brief message inside, and smiled. "He's coming," he murmured. "Blythe himself, he wants to clarify matters in private." I blinked. "He's walking into our den willingly?" "No, Watson. He believes. He's walking into my den, but he forgets. This time I've already sprung the trap." The knock came again less than an hour later, and Edmund Blythe entered the sitting room with the precision of a man who'd rehearsed his poise in the sea. Mirror. He wore a black cravat and carried a silver-tipped cane, not for need, I suspected, but for theatre. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson, I trust you'll permit me a brief audience." Holmes gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course. Though I advise candor, we've little use for pleasantries." Blythe sat with the cool confidence of a chess master, 5 moves from mate. "I've heard troubling rumors that my name has been spoken in connection with certain false accusations. I'm here to put those to rest." Holmes leaned forward. "And what accusations would those be, Mr. Blythe?" The older man hesitated. "That I had knowledge of Henry Willoughby's crimes, that I had motive or opportunity to harm him, that I used the death of one partner to conceal the failures of another." "Failures," Holmes echoed. "Curious word choice." Blythe smiled faintly. "I am not a criminal, Mr. Holmes, nor a poisoner. I am a man who has spent 30 years upholding the law. My name carries weight in every court between London and Edinburgh." "Indeed," Holmes said. "And yet I have evidence of your signature, countersigned on probate documents tied to the Griggs estate, and 2 others, funds which were never received by their rightful beneficiaries. Funds, I might add, which passed through temporary accounts registered under Hastings and Blythe just days before vanishing. That proves nothing." "No?" Holmes rose, walked to the fireplace, and lifted a folder from the mantel. "Then let us consider the testimony of Abigail Lenner, recorded, in full and filed with the magistrate this morning. She attests not only to Henry's embezzlement, but to your knowledge of it, and to your threats made against her person should she reveal the truth." Blythe's jaw stiffened. "You would take the word of a disgraced clerk?" "I would take the word of a woman nearly drowned for her silence," Holmes replied, voice low and sharp. "And I would match it against the sudden disappearance of a third woman, Mrs. Eleanor Griggs, last seen a fortnight after filing a complaint against your office. Did you think her death by gas leak would go unnoticed? Did you think no one would wonder why she was found with a bruised temple and an unsigned settlement check in her kitchen drawer? Blythe stood abruptly. You have no proof. Holmes stepped forward, drawing something from his coat pocket, a small glass vial. Inside, a clear, viscous fluid shimmered in the gaslight. This, he said, was retrieved from your former clerk Howard Finch, moments before he attempted to smother Miss Lenner and dispose of her body in the Thames. He carried no explanation for it, only a name written on an envelope in your hand. Yours. Blythe's eyes flicked to the vial, then back to Holmes. His composure cracked, just for a second, but it was there. The twitch at the corner of his lip, the shift in weight from one foot to the other, and then, slowly, he exhaled. I should leave. You should stay, came a new voice from the hallway. Inspector Braga stepped inside, two constables flanking him. Edmund Blythe, you are hereby placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice and financial fraud. Blythe did not resist, but his eyes lingered on Holmes with something between hatred and awe. You always were theatrical, he muttered. Holmes offered only a small nod. And you, sir, were always careless with your endings. As Blythe was led from the room, the tension seemed to lift from the walls of 221B, like fog burning off under sudden sunlight. I turned to Holmes. So ends the play, but Holmes only shook his head. No, Watson, now begins the epilogue. He moved to the window and gazed down at the street, where the carriage bearing Edmund Blythe disappeared into the London traffic. Celia Willoughby died not because she was guilty, but because she was noble. She protected a woman who was silenced. She confronted a man who believed himself invincible, and in the end she went to her death smiling, not from madness but from certainty. He turned to me then. She knew this day would come, perhaps not soon, perhaps not in time to save herself, but she trusted that someone would look closer, that the truth would not remain buried. I nodded slowly, my voice tight. And you gave her that justice. Holmes looked down at the cooling tea on the table. He said nothing for a long time, then softly, No, Watson, we did. The fire in our sitting room had died down to embers, but neither Holmes nor I made a move to stir it. The events of the last days hung between us like thick velvet, weighty, muffling even the sounds of Baker Street outside. For all the activity, all the chase and revelation, there now remained a strange stillness. Blythe was in custody. Abigail was recovering under police protection. The full record of the embezzlement and the false conviction was already being reviewed by the Home Office. And yet Holmes sat as if waiting for something, not a new clue but a ripple from the past that hadn't yet finished reaching shore. I fetched the brandy and poured a measure into his glass without asking. He accepted it silently. She died for the truth, I said after some time, not quite a question. Holmes nodded, staring into the rim of his glass. Yes, but not for justice. That, tragically, came too late for her. And yet I don't believe she would have done anything differently. She wouldn't, Holmes murmured. Some people understand that to shield the innocent is to bear a heavier burden than guilt. Celia Willoughby took that burden with her to the gallows. But she smiled, because she believed someone would see past the lie. His voice was quiet, but there was a rare tremor in it, quickly subdued. The next morning Holmes surprised me. Instead of his usual avoidance of press attention, he penned a letter to the Times. It was measured, factual, but unwavering in its assertion that a miscarriage of justice had taken place. The letter made no direct accusations against Scotland. Holmes was always careful about which bridges he burned, but it painted in no uncertain terms a portrait of how ambition, negligence, and arrogance had condemned an innocent woman to die. By noon, the papers had latched onto the story. The Gallows Smile. Holmes reopens the Willoughby case, read the bold type in the late editions. Letters to the editor appeared within days. Some accused Holmes of theatrical interference, others lauded him for the exposure of corruption, so within the legal system. But the most striking came from a name I had not expected, Chaplain J.E. Collingwood. It was short, but the ink was dark, deliberate. He recounted with simplicity and great sadness the morning of the execution. He spoke of how Celia had declined the usual prayer, how she had instead whispered something to him, words he had until now hesitated to share. She said, "Tell the man who reads the paper that I forgive him. He will know what I mean." "Watson," Holmes said softly as he read it aloud. "She meant me." She did. That afternoon, Holmes asked me to accompany him to the graveyard at Kensal Green. It was unseasonably cold for the time of year. A low mist clung to the headstones, and the skies hung like slate. The groundskeeper, recognizing Holmes, led us without comment to a simple plot. There was no headstone, only a wooden marker with her name carved neatly into it. Celia Margaret Willoughby, 1852-1895. She bore the silence with grace. Holmes stood for a long time, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. At last he crouched and placed a small sprig of foxglove on the soil, not in mockery but in quiet reclamation. He said nothing, but I knew what the gesture meant. She had died by it. Now, it marked her truth. As we turned to leave, I noticed a figure standing not far off, small, pale, and wrapped in a dark coat. Abigail. She approached with hesitant steps, her eyes damp but steady. "I didn't think I could," she said, voice just above a whisper. But I had to see it through. Holmes inclined his head gently. "You are safe now, Miss Lena." She nodded, but it shouldn't have cost her everything. "No," Holmes said. "It shouldn't have." We walked her to the gate, and she thanked us with a sincerity that neither flattered nor dramatized. It simply existed, raw and unguarded. "I'll go north," she said. "I have family near Durham. I'll try to start again." Holmes offered his hand. "And when you do, remember, starting again doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying it rightly." We watched her disappear into the haze. In the days that followed, Scotland Yard made a reluctant announcement. An internal inquiry would be conducted into the Willoughby case. Inspector Braga, though spared from disgrace, was quietly reassigned. Holmes declined an invitation to appear before the committee, citing, as he put it, an unwillingness to educate men too proud to learn. Instead, he returned to his usual methods, solving a jewel theft in Belgravia in 2 days, refusing payment from a duke whose arrogance irked him. But I noticed something in him had changed. He was quieter in the evenings, more prone to long silences at the window, his violin idle more often than not. And then, nearly a month after Blythe's arrest, he handed me a sealed envelope. "Should anything happen to me," he said lightly, "deliver this to Miss Abigail Lena. It contains the full account of the case, along with documentation of Celia's sacrifice. No law will restore her life, but perhaps memory can restore her honor." "Nothing will happen to you," I replied. Holmes only smiled faintly. "Then, it will remain unopened." One final development arrived in the form of a letter, not to Holmes but to me. It was from a clerk in the Home Office, and it bore news I had not expected. On recommendation from special counsel, the Crown is prepared to issue a posthumous pardon to Mrs. Celia Willoughby. Her name shall be formally cleared in the record. We owe this to your efforts, and to the unwavering pursuit of truth by Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I read it twice, then placed it beside the foxglove Holmes had pressed into the pages of his commonplace book. When I showed him, he only nodded once. "Justice," he said. "Delayed, but not denied." And so, the case of the widow's smile came to a close, not with applause nor vindication shouted from rooftops, but with the soft turn of a page, the settling of dust, and the knowledge that somewhere, beneath the still earth, a woman once erased now rested with her truth restored. It was nearly 3 weeks after the issuance of Celia Willoughby's posthumous pardon when I noticed Holmes had not left the flat for 2 consecutive days. This in itself was not unprecedented. He had endured longer stretches indoors, immersed in obscure monographs on tobacco ash or criminal anthropology, but there was something different about his manner this time. He was not idle, but neither was he truly occupied. He sat by the window as though waiting, not for a client, but for a voice that had gone silent. His meals remained untouched. He rose at odd hours and spoke less than usual. Even his violin, always within reach, gathered a thin film of dust by the hearth. I attempted conversation, casual mentions of lesser cases, newspaper scandals, even a curious incident involving a missing Bengal tiger from a circus in Lambeth, but Holmes waved them all aside. "The tiger will find its way into a wine cellar, Watson," he muttered without looking up, "and the police will find it because wine cellars, unlike mines, are incapable of lying." It was not the sort of sardonic quip I had grown used to. It had an edge to it, bitter, unresolved. I suspected, though he would not say it aloud, that the Willoughby affair had struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. For all his outward detachment, Holmes had a curious reverence for those rare individuals who lived by principle. Celia's quiet strength, her sacrifice, her unwillingness to yield even when the rope awaited, these had left their mark. And perhaps there was something else too, something still unsaid. The break came with the arrival of a letter. It bore no return address and was written in a delicate, unfamiliar hand. Holmes broke the seal carefully, and I saw his brow furrow as he read. Then, without a word, he passed it to me. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you now not with accusation nor regret, but with a final truth I must entrust to someone who understands what it is to see a thing clearly and still be unable to change its course. My name is Margaret Elmsley. I was once governess to Celia Willoughby, though she was not yet a Willoughby when I knew her. I cared for her from the age of 7 to 16, until she was sent to her aunt in Surrey to be introduced to society. In recent days I have read of your involvement in her case. I have read that you cleared her name. But there is something more you must know, something that Celia kept even from her closest allies. Celia had a sister. Her name was Josephine. The two were inseparable in youth, but Josephine was troubled. She disappeared in 1879 after being accused of forging letters from a former employer. No charges were filed, but she vanished. Celia believed she had drowned herself in the Avon. I know now that she did not. I saw her 3 weeks ago, outside the magistrate's court in Islington. She is alive, Mr. Holmes, and I believe, God help me, I believe she is using Celia's name." I looked up slowly. Holmes's expression was unreadable. "Is it possible?" I asked. He stood and crossed to the bookshelf. "More than possible, disturbingly probable. But the death, the execution," Holmes turned. "Bodies are buried, identities are not. You recall the morning we viewed Celia's remains at Newgate?" "Yes, of course. Did you examine her hands?" No. "Why?" "Because I did," Holmes said. "No sign of ink beneath the nails, no marks of a penwoman, and Celia was a lifelong diarist. Her writing was obsessive, even in prison. It struck me at the time as strange, though I said nothing. I assumed foolishly that grief had dulled my observation." He retrieved a journal from his drawer, a thin leather volume. "This is one of Celia's diaries, acquired from her housekeeper. Now compare it to this." He handed me a second sheet, a copy of the so-called threat letter found at the crime scene. At first glance, they appeared similar. Both elegant, sloping, confident. But Holmes pointed to the capitals, the sharpness of the C, the lack of curvature in the L, the heavier pressure in the leftward strokes. "This," Holmes said, tapping the original letter, "is not Celia's hand. It was forged. And the one person with both motive and ability to imitate her, the one who had lived alongside her long enough to study her intimately, was her sister." I stared at him. "You're suggesting that Celia Willoughby was not the woman who was hanged?" "I am suggesting," Holmes replied, "that the woman we saw executed may have been Josephine Elmsley, and that the real Celia may yet walk under another name." I rose slowly. "But why? Why would Josephine take her sister's place?" Holmes turned back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Perhaps guilt. Perhaps a last attempt to atone for whatever estranged them, or perhaps more chillingly, it was not Josephine's sacrifice at all, but her design. What if the woman who vanished from the firm's records, who was never fully accounted for during the trial, was not Abigail Lenner?" I felt the ground shift under my feet. "You mean Abigail?" Holmes turned. "We saved a woman from the river, yes, but did we ever verify who she truly was? She gave us names, memories, but those, Watson, can be borrowed." I sank into the chair. "Good Lord." Holmes's voice lowered. "What if Josephine, guilt-ridden, unstable, brilliant, in her way, constructed the perfect mask. She plays both sister and witness. She confesses in death and survives in silence. One sacrifices her name, the other lives absolved. But how do we know which was which? We don't, Holmes admitted. Not yet, but Margaret Elmsley's letter gives us a lead. She saw a face she recognized outside the magistrate's court recently. That means Josephine or Celia is still alive, and that means we can still uncover the truth. But why would she return? After all this, Holmes met my eyes. Because some part of her wanted to be seen. He retrieved his coat and reached for his revolver. We returned to Islington, Watson, quietly. We'll speak to the clerks, the bailiffs, the porters. Someone must have seen a woman matching Celia's description. And if they have, this case is not closed. It is only now coming to its end. Outside, the sky had turned a pale, indecisive grey. Rain threatened the rooftops but held back. We descended the steps of Baker Street without another word. The truth, it seemed, had never rested beneath the gallows. It had walked away from them. The ride to Islington was consumed by silence, but it was not the silence of idleness. I could feel Holmes's mind working beside me, precise and inwardly coiled, spinning down through the layers of deception the Willoughby affair had left in its wake. His fingers drummed lightly on his knee as the carriage rocked over the cobbles. And every so often he would close his eyes, not in weariness but in some mental reconstruction of faces, movements, intentions. He, too, was grappling with the weight of it. The idea that we had solved the case in the eyes of the law brought a man like Edmund Blythe to justice, secured a posthumous pardon for Celia, only to discover that the final truth had been hiding behind the very name we'd fought to vindicate. If Josephine had taken Celia's place, willingly or by force, then we were staring not at a miscarriage of justice, but at a misidentification so profound it recast every moment of our investigation in a darker light. The Islington magistrates. Court stood quiet beneath the slate sky, the last of the morning clerks filing in as we arrived. Holmes paused on the threshold, surveying the stone facade as though reading something no one else could see. "Do you believe Margaret Elmsley's sighting is credible?" I asked. She named a specific time, a specific doorway, and a detail. No gossip would invent. The clasp of a cameo brooch Celia used to wear, one with an ivory relief of Minerva. That, Watson, is not a coincidence. That is a memory jolted into clarity. We made our way to the clerk's desk and found a young man with an ink-stained sleeve and thinning hair who seemed grateful for the distraction of our presence. Holmes began with charm, as he always did, asking about recent filings, the docket of civil hearings, and slowly drawing the conversation toward familiar faces in the hallway. "Do many observers come to watch the trials?" Holmes asked. "Oh, yes. Sir, not always relatives either. Some are just curious types. We've got a few regulars, old pensioners usually." "Any women in particular stand out?" The clerk scratched his chin. "A few, yes, though there was one, middle-aged, elegant, oddly familiar now that I think about it. Came twice this past fortnight, stood near the corridor between chambers 2 and 4. Didn't speak to anyone, just watched." Holmes leaned slightly closer. "Was she wearing a dark green coat? A small cameo brooch?" The clerk blinked. "That's her. You know her?" "We're trying to." He thanked the man, then turned away with a new light behind his eyes. "She was here," Holmes murmured as we stepped into the corridor. "Not days ago. Recently, watching something, or someone." "But for what purpose?" Holmes didn't answer at first. We walked the halls in silence until we reached the corridor the clerk had mentioned. It was narrow, lined with benches, a cold wind occasionally sliding in through an old ventilation grate. Holmes moved his hand along the wall, absently, then stopped and looked at the list of hearings posted on a nearby corkboard. "What do you see, Watson?" I scanned it. "Small claims, property disputes, bankruptcy. Now look closer, 2 names here." He pointed to a set of hearings held on the same day, 2 weeks prior. Griggs versus Willoughby Estate. Lena Abigail. Petition for financial restitution. My breath caught. "She came to see the aftermath," I said. "More than that," Holmes replied. "She came to watch the world rebuild itself in her name, either to ensure that justice played out as she hoped, or to witness its consequences." We returned to Baker Street by way of Clerkenwell, Holmes stopping only once at a tobacconist to send a wire. When we arrived, Mrs. Hudson handed us a card. A visitor had come while we were away. The name chilled me. Miss Josephine Marsh. Holmes stared at the card for a long moment, then turned it over. On the back, a note had been written in careful, slanted hand. I know you are looking. I never meant for it to become this. If you still wish to speak with me, I shall wait 1 hour at Kensington Gardens, near the Bronze Stag. Come alone. He tucked the card into his breast pocket and reached for his coat once more. You're not going alone, I said. Holmes met my eyes. No, but she must believe I am. We arrived at Kensington Gardens within the hour. The fog had begun to roll back, replaced by the pale gold of late afternoon sun. Children's laughter echoed from a distant path, but here, by the statue of the stag, the world felt hushed. She was waiting, dressed in a high-collared navy coat, gloves, and a black, netted hat that obscured most of her features. But when she turned, there was no mistaking her. Whether she had been Celia or Josephine, she was the woman who had walked through every shadow of this case. Holmes approached, his steps slow and unthreatening. I remained just out of sight, behind a tree, but near enough to hear. You came, she said, her voice low and calm. You invited me. They stood for a moment in silence. You've put the pieces together, then? She asked. I have, Holmes said, though not all of them are in place. Some may never be. She exhaled, and it sounded more like sorrow than fear. I tried to disappear. I thought by taking her pain, I could redeem my own. But the truth. It doesn't let go, does it? Holmes said nothing. She asked me, the woman continued, the night before the trial. She knew what would happen. She had no faith the courts would listen. She asked me to take her place, said no one would. Question it. And they didn't. You stood at the gallows in her name, Holmes said softly. She turned her head slightly. No, she stood there. I lived. That's the truth. It was me in the court. It was me in the cell. And when the time came, I was too afraid. She looked at him now fully. She refused to let me intervene, said I would only destroy the little justice left. She told me to vanish, and I did. Until now. She smiled faintly, because I wanted someone to know, someone who would understand. Holmes's voice was quiet. You used the name Abigail, you fed us clues. I never expected it to go so far. I thought if I could point the way, if I could give her truth a voice, that would be enough. Why come forward? Because no voice can speak for her but mine. And mine is a poor substitute. Holmes extended a small envelope. There's a warrant, still unsigned. You can walk away again. Or you can write her story properly, sign your name to it. The world may not forgive you, but it will at least know you. She took the envelope with trembling fingers. Then she turned slowly and walked away into the trees. When Holmes rejoined me, I did not speak at first. The moment felt suspended in time. Do you believe she'll come forward? I asked finally. I believe she already has. He looked toward the bronze stag, now gleaming in the sun. She didn't vanish, Holmes said. She gave herself a second chance and returned to answer for it, in her way. And as the leaves stirred gently in the wind, I understood what Holmes had always meant about truth, that it is not always perfect, nor clean, nor timely, but it always eventually steps into the light. That night, Holmes slept. Not merely the shallow repose he often permitted himself between cases, but the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who had, for once, wrested order from a storm, not just of facts, but of emotion. I stayed up late at my writing desk, finishing the final notes for our records, and even as the gaslight flickered low, I hesitated to close the casebook, for despite all Holmes had uncovered, despite the intricate web of deception we had pulled, apart the lies caught on ink and signature, the false names and broken sisters, there remained a kind of silence in the conclusion. A truth exposed, yes, but wrapped still in the grey veil of humanity. This was not the neat, definitive justice of Scotland Yard reports or courtrooms. It was the older, more painful kind, born of grief, tempered by guilt, and sealed with the Quiet mercy of those who walk away rather than point fingers. In the morning, a small envelope arrived by post. No seal, only my name written in a clean, careful hand. Inside was a single sheet. Dr. Watson, you will forgive me for not addressing Mr. Holmes directly. His methods are for truth, not emotion. But you, your words, your eyes in the room, they were the ones I feared most. Yes, it was I who wore Celia's name, and no, not for malice, but for love. We had shared everything once, she and I, long before our lives took opposite paths. She believed in my ability to vanish, to protect the truth. I believed in her ability to withstand the fire. I was wrong. I thought if I gave you enough of the puzzle, you might solve it without ever learning that I was its missing piece. But you were too good, or perhaps too human. You looked past my mask. I have left London. I will not return. The world has its answers now, and she has her name back. That is more than I ever dreamed we could manage. I ask only this. Do not look for me. Let my sister's smile be the last image this city remembers. Yours in shadow, J.E. I passed it to Holmes when he awoke. He read it slowly, folding the letter only once before slipping it into his desk drawer. She was never truly invisible, he murmured. She simply knew how to disappear in full view. A few days later, the official announcements came. The Home Office completed its quiet inquiry into the Willoughby case and acknowledged irregularities in the original conviction. No one named Josephine Elmsley. There was no appetite. It seemed for unearthing the kind of truth that stains a system rather than vindicates it. The pardon stood. Celia's name at least was cleared, and Holmes, content perhaps with that quiet resolution, did not push further. But I could tell that he remained uneasy in moments. When the fire burned low in the evenings, he would sometimes glance toward the window with that peculiar stillness of his, not alert, not brooding, but listening, as if expecting one final knock, one final word from the one woman who had eluded, even him, not by wit, but by something more elusive, remorse. Then came an unexpected visit from Inspector Braga. He arrived without notice one damp morning, his expression stiff with pride and something unspoken that hovered just beneath the formalities. I came, he said, to return this. He handed Holmes a file, slightly worn at the edges, marked, Simply Willoughby. The Home Office is closing the file. They've redacted names, sealed testimony, and buried the rest. But I thought you might want it. For the truth. Holmes took it without comment. Braga lingered for a moment, his hands behind his back. I read your letter to the Times, he added quietly. Not flattering to the Yard, but fair. We failed her. Holmes looked up at that. No, he said. You failed yourselves. Braga nodded once and left. Inside the file, among the copied statements and closed case reports, was a photograph I hadn't seen before. A studio portrait, slightly yellowed at the corners. It showed Celia, undeniably her, or the woman we believed to be her, seated with a younger sister beside her, both of them holding books in their laps, their expressions caught somewhere between laughter and composure. Sisters, once. The image had been taken years earlier, but it captured something Holmes had never quite articulated. Two lives bound together by something older than logic. She's not smiling, I said quietly. Neither of them are. Holmes traced the edge of the photo with one finger. Because the camera cannot capture what the soul conceals, that smile came later, when everything had been lost, and yet something had been preserved. He closed the file and set it on the shelf, not beside the others marked solved, but in a separate drawer, a compartment I'd never noticed before, labeled simply Mercy. Spring came reluctantly to London that year. Rain still fell more often than sun, and the river remained heavy with fog most mornings, but life resumed its pace and new cases arrived. Holmes, though slow to return to his usual fervour, accepted a request from the Foreign Office concerning a missing code book and a dead courier in Whitehall. The case, he assured me, would require no disguises and no gallows, but I noticed that even during that affair, he carried with him a folded clipping from the Times, a tiny notice beneath the births and deaths column. In quiet recognition, The memory of C.W. is laid to rest by those who walk in silence. Justice, though late, did not forget. It bore no signature, but we both knew who had placed it. And so the final truth of the widow's smile did not come with a gavel or a headline, but with that brief, anonymous line printed in black ink between life's other announcements. A whisper amid the shouts. A soft closing of the circle. Holmes never spoke of her again. But I knew when he passed her name in our files, he would sometimes pause, not for deduction, but in acknowledgement. She had fooled us all, yes, and in doing so, had bought her sister a strange and sorrowful redemption. The case had begun with a smile on the gallows, and it ended, not with vengeance nor confession, but with forgiveness. The final act of the case unfolded not in a courtroom, nor in the press, but in a small drawing room in Hampstead, neutral, sun-dappled and quiet. It was here, at Holmes's careful arrangement, that the last conversation took place. Inspector Braga seated stiffly in an armchair. The Solicitor General, summoned under the guise of reviewing the implications of conflicting testimonies, and seated opposite them, with her hands folded calmly in her lap, was the woman who had once been known as Abigail Lenner, who had once stood behind a veil, playing twin to her sister's silence. She did not wear disguise now, no hat, no veil. Only her name, spoken clearly, evenly, and at last without pretense. "My name," she said, "is Josephine Elmsley." Braga looked up from his notes. "You confirm, then, that it was you who presented yourself to Scotland Yard under the name Abigail Lenner?" "I do. I lived as her for weeks. I gave a statement. It was not a lie, not entirely. The details I gave you were true, but the name was not mine to wear. I wore it for protection, for penance." The Solicitor General shifted uncomfortably. "And the woman executed at Newgate? The woman buried under the name Celia Willoughby?" Josephine did not flinch. "She was my sister. I took her place in the court for days. We passed the role between us in those early stages. I helped her write the letters. She let me attend the hearings. She was the one who stood trial, but the world never saw the handoff. And when the sentence was passed, she ordered me to vanish. I obeyed. I thought it was cowardice, but now I think it was love. The silence that followed was thick, dense with legal weight and personal ruin." Braga spoke first. "You know the implications. Impersonation of a witness, obstruction of justice. You could be arrested." Holmes, until then seated near the window, finally turned toward them. "And to what end, gentlemen?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "You would prosecute a woman who ensured the truth came to light, who surrendered her sister's secrets, exposed a powerful man's crimes, and saved an innocent life, her own, from being buried alongside the lie." The Solicitor General hesitated. "That may be, but the law—" "Was already satisfied," Holmes said sharply. "Celia Willoughby was hanged. Edmund Blythe has been convicted. The estate funds have been returned. The truth, though belated, has been recorded." He stepped forward, placing a folded sheet on the table. It was the signed confession of Josephine Elmsley, notarized, sealed, and already dated. "She does not seek immunity," Holmes added, "only accuracy." "At last?" Braga looked to Josephine. "And what do you want, truly?" She glanced at Holmes, then at the sunlight breaking faintly across the carpet. "I want my sister remembered for what she was, not as a murderess, not as a pawn, but as a woman who believed someone would care enough to look again. She gave up everything for justice. I gave up my name so she could reach it. That is all I ever wanted." Braga rose slowly. "The Yard will not pursue you further, so long as you remain absent from future proceedings." The Solicitor General said nothing. But he too stood accepting what had been unspoken from the moment Holmes called this meeting, that not all truths fit within the bounds of prosecution. Some truths must simply be accepted and then left to rest. They departed without handshakes. Josephine lingered a moment longer, then turned to Holmes. "You saw it all before I did." "I saw what you left behind," he corrected gently. "The handwriting, the inconsistencies, the burden." She offered a small smile. "And now?" "Now you write your own ending." She nodded, slipped on her coat, and left without another word. For a long moment, Holmes stood silently in the window's light. I watched him from across the room, and when I finally spoke, it was not as a chronicler but as a friend. You did what Scotland Yard never could. You saved her, twice. But Holmes's gaze did not lift from the street below. No, Watson. She saved herself. All I did was refuse to accept the simplest version of the story. He crossed to his desk and for the first time in days opened the casebook. He turned to the final page and wrote the closing line beneath his own initials. The truth once buried does not rot. It waits. And with that he closed the book, not in triumph, not in relief, but in quiet, enduring reverence for the woman who died, the woman who walked away, and the smile that proved, even at the edge of death, that justice might still be watching.